My wife started cheating on me. I saw it on the cameras. When we got divorced, I showed the video footage of her cheating on me, and then I married her sister. What do you do when the person you thought was your partner turns into someone completely unrecognizable? The kind of person you would never have expected to deceive you or act hypocritically. That was the bitter realization that hit me when I discovered the truth about my wife. My name is Ethan Davis, and I'm 36 years old, working as an IT administrator for a financial firm that has offices spread across several states. I had been married for 6 years to Olivia, at least, until the day I found out she had been living a lie. Our marriage had seemed fine, maybe even better than fine, at least to me. We were talking about starting a family, looking at future plans, and living the kind of life I thought was stable and secure. Olivia ran her own boutique spa in the city, a business she had built from the ground up. I always admired her work ethic and the way she managed her employees with both discipline and kindness. Her business was doing well, until the world stopped in 2020, when the pandemic brought everything to a grinding halt. The pandemic was a turning point for many people, including us. With Olivia's spa forced to close temporarily and my job shifting to a remote model, we suddenly found ourselves spending much more time together than we ever had before. At first, it felt like a blessing in disguise. Without the usual distractions of work, we spent the early weeks of the lockdown reconnecting. We watched movies, cooked elaborate meals, and slept in like we hadn't in years. It was nice. I remember thinking that this unexpected break from the world was helping us grow closer. But then the cracks started to show. After about a month of quarantine, things began to change. Olivia became restless, more irritable, and she started pulling away. I figured it was just the stress of everything, the uncertainty, the loss of her business, and the constant barrage of news. I didn't blame her. After all, we were all struggling in our own ways to adjust to the new normal. But Olivia's behavior went beyond stress. She began picking fights over the smallest things. Things like me leaving a cup out on the counter or not folding the laundry a certain way. Her patience seemed to have evaporated overnight. At first, I tried to be understanding. I let her vent, hoping it was just a phase, something that would pass when life returned to normal. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just temporary frustration. Olivia was pulling away emotionally, becoming distant and cold. What bothered me most was that she had stopped confiding in me. The long talks we used to have, the deep conversations about life, were replaced with awkward silences and excuses about being tired. Something was wrong, but every time I asked her about it, she would brush it off or snap at me. Then there was the cologne. I don't wear cologne, but I started noticing the faint scent of a man's cologne lingering in the house after I came home from running errands. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as my imagination. Maybe it was from the grocery store or something I brushed against while I was out. But it happened again and again, and every time, Olivia had no explanation for it. I would ask her casually if she had been out or if we had visitors, but she would just roll her eyes and say no. It made me uneasy, but I didn't push it further. Around this time, Olivia started taking more trips out of the house. With her spa closed, there wasn't much reason for her to leave. But she always found an excuse. I need to grab some groceries, or I'm going for a walk to clear my head. But the trips became more frequent, and she would be gone for hours at a time. When she came back, she always seemed flustered, and on more than one occasion, she went straight to the shower as soon as she got home. When I asked her why she needed to shower right away, she would just say she felt gross from being out in public during a pandemic. It didn't make sense. Olivia was never one to get overly paranoid about germs. As the weeks wore on, things escalated even further. Olivia became obsessed with the new social distancing guidelines and safety protocols that were rolled out by the city. She insisted that we follow every rule to the letter, which I had no problem with at first. But she took it to an extreme. She started measuring the distance between us and the house, making sure we were always at least 6 feet apart, even though we lived under the same roof. Then came the worst part. She announced that we could no longer sleep in the same bed. "We need to be careful," she said one night as I got ready for bed. "You've been out and about more than I have. I think it's safer if we sleep in separate rooms for now." I stared at her, baffled. "What are you talking about? We've been together this whole time." What difference does it make now? It's just temporary, she insisted, until things settle down. You can sleep in the guest room. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to argue, but she wouldn't budge. She had already set up a separate bathroom for herself, dividing our dishes, and even insisted that we do our own laundry separately to avoid cross-contamination. It was like we had become strangers living in the same house. I spent the next few weeks sleeping in the guest room, wondering what had happened to my marriage. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Olivia stopped talking to me about anything meaningful. Our conversations became shallow and transactional, like we were two people who happened to live under the same roof but had no connection beyond that. And then came the reports. Our city had set up a hotline for residents to report anyone who wasn't following the pandemic guidelines. I didn't think much of it at the time, but Olivia seemed to take it as her personal mission to enforce the rules. She would sit by the window, watching our neighbors, and call the hotline whenever she saw someone breaking the rules. Whether it was kids playing too close together in the yard, or someone walking their dog without a mask, she was quick to pick up the phone and report them. It made me uncomfortable, to say the least. I tried to talk to her about it, telling her that it wasn't worth alienating our neighbors over something like this. But she didn't see it that way. It's for their own good, she said dismissively. If they won't take care of themselves, someone has to. I couldn't believe how far she had gone. It was like I didn't even know who she was anymore. The woman I had married was caring, compassionate, and thoughtful. This person, this stranger in my house, was controlling, judgmental, and obsessed with power. I couldn't stand it. The turning point came one night when I was working late in my home office. I had installed a security system with cameras around the house a few years ago, mostly for peace of mind, but I hadn't really used them much. That night, something told me to check the footage. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just paranoia. Either way, I logged into the system from my laptop and started reviewing the footage from the past few days. What I saw changed everything. There, on the screen, was Olivia, sitting on the couch, talking on the phone. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation, until I heard her tone shift. "Yeah, he's out for the night," she said in a low, almost seductive voice. "Come over. I've missed you." My heart sank. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I didn't need to. The way she was talking, the way she smiled as she listened to the person on the other end, it was clear. This wasn't just a phone call. She was talking to someone who wasn't me. I fast-forwarded through the footage, my hands shaking. A man arrived at the house a short while later. He walked right in like he belonged there. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just any man. It was Greg, one of Olivia's co-workers from the spa. I had met him a few times at work events, and he always seemed friendly, but I never thought anything of it. Now, here he was, walking into my house with my wife. I watched in horror as they laughed together, kissed, and disappeared into the master bedroom, the room that used to be mine. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? How had I missed it? Was I blind? Or had I just been too trusting? Either way, it didn't matter now. The damage was done. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I couldn't stay in this marriage, not after what I had seen. Olivia had been lying to me, cheating on me in my own home, and I couldn't forgive that. It was over. For the next week, I gathered all the evidence I needed. I copied the footage from the security cameras and backed everything up onto an external hard drive. I made sure I had everything in order before confronting Olivia. When the day came, I walked into the living room where Olivia was sitting, scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly, then went back to whatever she was doing, barely acknowledging me. "Olivia," I said, my voice calm but firm. She glanced up again. "What?" "We need to talk." She sighed, clearly annoyed. "About what?" I tossed a manila envelope onto the coffee table in front of her. "About this." She picked it up and opened it, her eyes widening as she realized what it was. "Divorce papers." "Ethan, what is this?" she stammered, her face going pale. "It's over, Olivia," I said, standing over her. "I know about Greg. I've known for weeks." Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to find words. I can explain." "Don't bother." I cut her off. "I've seen everything. The cameras recorded it all. There's nothing left to explain. Her face contorted in shock, then anger. You've been spying on me? I scoffed. Spying? You're the one who's been sneaking around, cheating on me in my own house. You think I wouldn't find out? Did you really believe I was that blind? She stood up, her hands shaking as she held the papers. This isn't fair. You can't just end things like this. I can, and I am, I replied, my voice cold. You made your choice when you decided to betray me. Now, you'll have to live with the consequences. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room. Olivia stormed out of the room, clutching the divorce papers in her hand as though she could strangle the life out of them. I stood there in the living room, still trying to process the fact that my marriage was truly over. The house felt too quiet, like a void had opened up between us, and despite everything that had happened, it still felt surreal. But I had no choice. There was no going back now. For the next few days, Olivia avoided me as much as possible. She stayed in the guest room while I took over the master bedroom again. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained, awkward, and devoid of the affection we once shared. I couldn't help but wonder how long she'd been planning this with Greg. Was this an impulsive affair born out of the stress of the pandemic, or had this been brewing long before I ever noticed the signs? It didn't really matter anymore. One night, a week after I handed her the divorce papers, Olivia came into the living room while I was watching TV. She stood in the doorway for a few moments, as if trying to find the courage to speak. Finally, she broke the silence. Ethan, can we talk? She asked quietly. I muted the TV and turned to face her. I had no idea what she wanted, but I wasn't in the mood for any more drama. What is it? She sat down on the edge of the couch, careful to keep her distance from me. I've been thinking about everything. About us. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't respond at first. I didn't know how to. Apologies were fine, but they didn't undo the damage. They didn't take away the hurt, the betrayal. After a long pause, I finally spoke. I appreciate the apology, Olivia, I said, my voice measured. But we're past that. What you did, it can't be undone. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know I messed everything up. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to hear it from me. I didn't want things to end like this. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. How did you think this would end? You were cheating on me, Olivia. What did you think was going to happen? I wasn't thinking, she cried, her voice breaking. I wasn't thinking clearly, okay? I was stressed, the pandemic, the business shutting down, everything. It all got to me. Greg was there, and I don't know. It just happened. It just happened, I repeated, shaking my head. That's your explanation? She wiped her eyes, sniffling. I don't know what else to say. I never meant to hurt you. I swear I didn't. But I did, and I'll have to live with that. The anger that had been simmering inside me for weeks was starting to boil over. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. You know what? I don't even care anymore. You made your choice, Olivia. You made the decision to cheat on me in our own home. You could have told me you were unhappy. We could have worked on things. But you didn't. You took the easy way out. I wasn't unhappy, she said softly. I don't know. I got caught up in something stupid, and now I'm paying the price. I stared at her, the woman I once loved, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. But all I saw now was a stranger. Yeah, you are, I said coldly. And so am I. She didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her shoulders slumped in defeat. After a few moments, she stood up and quietly walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that. Olivia didn't contest anything. In fact, she seemed eager to get it over with, as if she couldn't bear the weight of her own guilt any longer. We divided our assets, and she moved out of the house a few weeks later. I was relieved to see her go, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't how things were supposed to turn out. The house felt different without her. Quieter, but also strangely hollow. I had spent years building a life with Olivia, and now that life was gone. I wandered through the empty rooms, wondering what to do with the remnants of our marriage. Her scent still lingered in the air, her clothes still hung in the closet, and her favorite books lined the shelves. I knew I had to get rid of it all if I ever wanted to move on, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it just yet. One day, after weeks of avoiding the inevitable, I decided to take the first step toward reclaiming my life. I grabbed a few boxes from the garage and started packing up Olivia's things. Her clothes, her shoes, her books. They all went into the boxes, one by one. As I worked, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, relief. It was as if each item I packed away was another piece of her that I was finally letting go of. When I was finished, I stacked the boxes by the front door and stared at them for a long time. This was it, the final goodbye. I took a deep breath and grabbed my phone, sending Olivia a text. "Your things are packed and ready for pickup. Let me know when you'll come by." She responded almost immediately. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon. Thanks." The next day, I waited for her to arrive. I wasn't sure how I would feel seeing her again after everything that had happened. Part of me dreaded it, while another part of me wanted closure. When she finally pulled up in front of the house, I watched from the window as she got out of the car. She looked different, thinner, more tired, as if the weight of the last few months had taken its toll on her. I opened the door as she approached, and for a moment, we just stood there in awkward silence. Finally, I stepped aside to let her in. "The boxes are by the door," I said, gesturing toward the neatly stacked pile. She nodded, her eyes scanning the house as if she were seeing it for the last time. "Thanks," she said quietly. She started loading the boxes into her car, and I helped her, though neither of us said much. It was strange how we could go from being married to barely speaking, like we were two strangers who had nothing left to say to each other. But maybe that was the truth. Maybe we were strangers now. When the last box was loaded into her car, Olivia turned to me, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything." I nodded, but I didn't have the energy to say anything in return. I had heard her apologies before, and they didn't change anything. She stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to say something, but when I didn't, she sighed and got into her car. I watched as she drove away, disappearing down the street, and with her, the final traces of our life together. With Olivia gone, I focused on moving forward. It wasn't easy. The house still felt empty, and the silence was often deafening. But I started to make changes, little by little. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and replaced the old, worn-out pieces we had bought together. I needed to reclaim this space as my own, to make it feel like my home, not a reminder of the life I had lost. I also threw myself into my work. The remote setup gave me more flexibility, but I often found myself logging extra hours just to keep my mind occupied. Anything to avoid thinking about Olivia, or the way things had ended. The more I worked, the less time I had to dwell on the past. But as the months passed, I realized that I couldn't keep running from it forever. I needed closure, not just with Olivia, but with myself. I needed to forgive myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for trusting her blindly, for believing that our marriage was something it wasn't. It took time, but slowly, I began to heal. Part of that healing process involved reconnecting with old friends. I had isolated myself during the last few years of my marriage, too focused on work and my relationship with Olivia to maintain my friendships. But now, I reached out to people I hadn't seen in years. I started meeting up with friends for drinks, going on hikes, and even joining a local running club. It felt good to be social again, to remind myself that there was more to life than the pain I had been carrying. One evening, I met up with an old friend from college, Matt, for a drink. We hadn't spoken in years, but he had heard about the divorce through mutual friends and wanted to catch up. We met at a bar downtown, and after a few drinks, the conversation naturally turned to what had happened with Olivia. "I'm sorry to hear about the divorce, man," Matt said, taking a sip of his beer. "I had no idea things were so bad." "Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly something I advertised," I replied with a bitter smile. "I get that," he said, nodding. "But still, it sucks. You doing okay?" I'm getting there, I said, shrugging. It's been tough, but I'm trying to move on. He gave me a sympathetic look. If you ever need to talk, or just want to hang out, let me know. I'm always around. Thanks, man, I said, appreciating the gesture. I'll take you up on that. As the night went on, we reminisced about old times, sharing stories from college and laughing about the stupid things we used to do. It felt good to reconnect with someone who had known me before everything fell apart, someone who reminded me of who I was before Olivia. By the time I left the bar, I felt lighter than I had in months. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was just the realization that I was finally starting to move on. Either way, I knew I was on the right path. A few weeks later, I got a call from Olivia's sister, Rachel. I hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, and I was surprised to see her name pop up on my phone. We had always gotten along well, but I hadn't expected to hear from her now that Olivia and I were no longer together. "Hey, Ethan, it's Rachel," she said when I answered. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "No, not at all," I replied, curious about why she was calling. "What's up?" "I wanted to check in on you," she said, her voice soft. "I know things have been rough lately, and I just wanted to see how you're doing." I was taken aback by her kindness. "I'm doing okay," I said, unsure of what else to say. "Thanks for asking." There was a pause on the other end of the line before she spoke again. "I also wanted to apologize for what happened with Olivia. I know it's not my place, but I feel like I should say something." "You don't have to apologize for her," I said quickly. "None of this was your fault." "I know, but still, I feel terrible about what she did to you. You didn't deserve that." Her words touched me more than I expected. "Thanks, Rachel. That means a lot." We chatted for a few more minutes before saying goodbye, and after I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Maybe it wasn't the closure I had been looking for, but it was something. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that there were people who cared about me, even after everything that had happened. As the months passed, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I moved out of the house Olivia and I had shared and found a new place in a different part of town. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind and focus on the future. One evening, while unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I came across an old photo of Olivia and me. We were smiling, happy, and carefree, back when I thought we had the whole world ahead of us. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but it quickly passed. I had mourned the end of our marriage long enough. It was time to move on. I placed the photo in the bottom of a box, sealed it shut, and pushed it into the back of my closet, where it would stay. It was a part of my past, but it didn't define my future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with that. Months had passed since I moved out of the house Olivia and I once shared. My new apartment was small but comfortable, with enough space for me to rebuild my life at my own pace. I had spent the past few months slowly packing away the memories of our relationship, both literal and emotional, into boxes that I no longer needed to open. It was part of my process, a way to give myself the space I needed to heal. The last few months had been full of small but important changes. At first, I threw myself into work. After the divorce, I had taken on more projects than usual, diving deep into the technical aspects of my job, managing the IT systems for the financial firm that kept me busy. The remote setup had remained in place, and that gave me flexibility, but it also kept me tethered to my apartment for long hours at a time. The more I worked, the more I could numb the lingering emotions I had about Olivia and what had happened between us. Eventually, though, I realized that work wasn't enough. As much as it helped me avoid thinking about the past, I knew that I couldn't continue like this forever. That's when I started reaching out to friends again, reconnecting with people I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't easy at first. I had become so used to isolating myself during the last few years of my marriage that socializing again felt strange, almost foreign. But it turned out to be exactly what I needed. One of the most surprising reconnections came from someone I never expected, Rachel, Olivia's younger sister. After that phone call from Rachel months ago, where she apologized for Olivia's actions, I didn't think I'd hear from her again. We hadn't been close, and I figured our brief conversation would be the last of it. But then, one day, I got a message from her. "Hey, Ethan, how are you doing? Been thinking about you lately. Let's grab coffee sometime?" I stared at the message for a long time, not quite sure how to respond. It wasn't that I had any negative feelings toward Rachel. In fact, she had been one of the few people who had shown me kindness during the worst of the divorce. But meeting up with her felt complicated. She was Olivia's sister, after all, and as much as I wanted to move on, part of me worried about reopening old wounds. Still, after some hesitation, I replied, "Sure, I'd like that. How about this weekend?" We met at a small cafe downtown, one of those quiet places tucked away from the busier streets. When I walked in, I spotted Rachel right away, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in front of her. She waved when she saw me, and I made my way over. "Hey, Ethan," she greeted me with a smile as I sat down. "It's good to see you." "You too, Rachel," I said, feeling a bit awkward but managing a smile in return. "Thanks for reaching out." "I've been meaning to for a while," she said, sipping her coffee. "I know things have been difficult, to say the least. I just wanted to check in on you. See how you're doing." "I appreciate that," I replied, nodding. "I'm doing okay. It's been rough, but I'm getting through it." She looked at me with concern. "I can't even imagine what you've been through. I'm so sorry for everything Olivia put you through." "I know I said it before, but I really mean it." "I know you do, Rachel," I said softly, "and you don't need to keep apologizing for her. It wasn't your fault." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, but it's hard not to feel guilty. I mean, she's my sister. I've seen her do some messed up things in the past, but this was something else. She didn't just hurt you, she hurt all of us." I hadn't really thought about how Olivia's actions had impacted her family. Of course, they had been shocked and disappointed when everything came to light, but hearing Rachel say it like that made me realize just how deep the betrayal ran. "Yeah, it's been tough," I admitted, "but I'm trying to move on. I've started making some changes, you know? New place, new routines. Trying to focus on the future instead of the past." "That's good to hear," she said, her expression softening. "You deserve to move on and be happy." We spent the next hour talking, catching up on what had been going on in our lives since the divorce. It was surprisingly easy to talk to Rachel, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could just be myself without any lingering tension. She told me about her job as a graphic designer and how she had been working remotely since the pandemic started. We laughed about how both of us had become experts at Zoom meetings and navigating the awkwardness of working from home. By the time we finished our coffee, I realized how much I had missed having casual, easygoing conversations like this. It was a reminder that life could still be enjoyable, even after everything that had happened. As we stood up to leave, Rachel smiled at me. "Let's do this again sometime," she said. "It was really nice catching up." "Yeah, I'd like that," I replied genuinely. "Thanks for reaching out." We parted ways, and as I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The past was behind me, and while it hadn't been easy, I was starting to see that there was a future ahead, a future where I could be happy again. Over the next few months, Rachel and I met up more often. At first, it was just casual coffee meetups or the occasional lunch, but as we spent more time together, we started forming a closer bond. I hadn't expected it, but our friendship grew naturally, and soon, it became a regular part of my life. Rachel was easy to talk to, and we shared a lot of the same interests: music, books, movies. We even started going for runs together at the park near my apartment, something that had become part of my routine since I moved. It was refreshing to have someone to talk to who understood the situation but wasn't bogged down by the past. Rachel never brought up Olivia unless I mentioned it, and when we did talk about her, it was more in the context of moving on rather than dwelling on what had happened. One afternoon, after a particularly long run, we sat down on a bench to catch our breath. Rachel wiped the sweat from her forehead and smiled at me. "You're getting faster," she said teasingly. "I'm starting to think I need to step up my game to keep up with you." I laughed. "I don't know about that. You've been running circles around me since we started." "Yeah, well, I've had more practice," she said with a grin. "But seriously, you're doing great." I leaned back on the bench, looking out at the park. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the trees and the jogging path. For a moment, I just enjoyed the peacefulness of it all, the calm that had become so rare in my life over the past year. "You know," Rachel said after a while, her tone more serious, I'm really glad we've been spending time together. I wasn't sure how things would be after everything, but I don't know. It feels good. Like we've found a new normal. I nodded, understanding what she meant. Yeah, I feel the same way. It's been nice to have someone to talk to. Someone who gets it. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a softness to her gaze that made my heart skip a beat. I quickly brushed the thought aside, reminding myself that she was Olivia's sister. Complicating things between us was the last thing I needed, but as time went on, those thoughts became harder to ignore. The more time Rachel and I spent together, the more I realized how much I enjoyed her company. She had a way of making me laugh, even on days when I felt weighed down by everything that had happened. She was supportive, kind, and always there when I needed someone to talk to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I started to feel something more than friendship. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a slow-burning realization that grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself looking forward to our meetups, thinking about her when we weren't together, and missing her more than I expected when we didn't talk for a few days. It was confusing, to say the least. Part of me felt like it was too soon to even consider the possibility of a new relationship, especially with Rachel, of all people. But another part of me, a part that had been dormant for so long, was starting to wake up. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that it was just a rebound, a fleeting feeling that would pass. But the more I tried to push it down, the more it bubbled to the surface. Every time Rachel smiled at me, every time she laughed at one of my dumb jokes, I felt it, a spark that I couldn't deny. One evening, after we had finished dinner at a new restaurant downtown, we decided to take a walk through the city. It was a warm night, the kind of summer evening where the air feels thick and alive, buzzing with the energy of the city around us. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional laughter from nearby restaurants. I love nights like this, Rachel said suddenly, breaking the silence. It's so peaceful, you know? It feels like the whole city is just alive. Yeah, I know what you mean, I replied, glancing at her. There's something calming about it. We continued walking, and as we passed by a small park, Rachel stopped and turned to me. Her eyes were filled with that same softness I had noticed before, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. Ethan, she began, her voice hesitant. There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. I felt my heart rate pick up, a mix of anticipation and anxiety swirling in my chest. What is it? She bit her lip, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting my eyes again. I know this might sound crazy, and maybe I'm completely off base here, but have you ever thought about us? Like, more than just friends? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. I stared at her, my mind racing. I had thought about it, more times than I cared to admit, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that I hadn't been prepared for. Yeah, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I have. Rachel's expression softened, and she took a step closer to me. I don't want to make things weird or complicate anything, but I can't help how I feel. I've grown really close to you these past few months, and I think I'm falling for you. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. This was it, the moment I had been both dreading and hoping for. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure what to say. I feel the same way, I finally said, my voice steadying as I spoke. I've been trying to ignore it because of everything, but I can't deny it anymore. Rachel smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and happiness. So, what do we do now? I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling over me. This was uncharted territory, and there was no roadmap for how to navigate it. But in that moment, standing in the middle of the city with Rachel by my side, I realized that I didn't want to run from it anymore. I don't know, I admitted, but I think we figure it out together. She smiled, and before I could say anything else, she closed the distance between us and kissed me. That kiss changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and I slowly began to explore the possibility of something more than friendship. We took things slow, cautious of the delicate nature of our situation. We both knew that it wouldn't be easy, especially given the complicated history we shared because of Olivia. But despite the challenges, there was something undeniably real between us, something that we couldn't ignore. We kept our budding relationship quiet at first, not wanting to stir up any unnecessary drama. But as the weeks turned into months, it became harder to keep it a secret. We were spending more and more time together, and it wasn't long before our friends started to notice. One night, while we were out at a small bar with some mutual friends, one of them, Sarah, pulled me aside. "Okay, spill," she said, a mischievous grin on her face. "What's going on with you and Rachel?" I glanced over at Rachel, who was laughing with some of the others at the bar, and then back at Sarah. "What do you mean?" "Oh, come on," she said, rolling her eyes. "You guys have been practically inseparable lately. It's pretty obvious something's going on." I hesitated for a moment before sighing. "All right, fine. We've been seeing each other." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but there was a gleam of excitement in them as well. "Really? Wow, I didn't see that coming. But good for you guys. I mean, I'm happy for you." "Thanks," I said, relieved that she didn't seem judgmental. "It's still new, and we're trying to take things slow." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I get it, but I have to ask, what about Olivia? Does she know?" I winced at the mention of Olivia. That was the one thing I had been avoiding, telling her. I hadn't spoken to her since she picked up her things from the house months ago, and I wasn't sure how she would react to the news of me dating her sister. "I don't know if she knows," I admitted. "And honestly, I'm not sure how to handle that." Sarah gave me a sympathetic look. "That's a tough one. But hey, it's your life, Ethan. You deserve to be happy. And if Rachel makes you happy, then that's all that matters." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the night. I knew that at some point, I would have to face the reality of Olivia finding out about Rachel and me. But for now, I was content to live in the moment, to enjoy the happiness that I had found with someone who understood me in a way few people ever had. The months passed, and as Rachel and I grew closer, we decided it was time to make our relationship public. We had been careful, not wanting to cause any unnecessary waves, but at some point, we realized that we couldn't keep hiding forever. It was a warm summer evening when Rachel and I decided to have a small gathering at my apartment with some close friends. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a casual get-together with drinks and good food. But it felt like a milestone for us, a way of stepping into the open and embracing our relationship. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since the divorce, I felt like I had truly moved on. I had found happiness again, and it was with someone who made me feel understood, valued, and loved. Rachel caught my eye from across the room, and as she smiled at me, I knew that I had made the right choice. We were moving forward, together. Things with Rachel were going well, better than I could have expected, considering the complications that came with dating my ex-wife's sister. We'd kept our relationship quiet for a while, mostly to avoid unnecessary drama, but as time passed, it felt right to embrace what we had. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and even though there was a history that connected us through Olivia, Rachel and I had built something separate, something real. I thought a lot about the complexities of our situation, especially how it would affect our lives moving forward. While most of our friends were supportive, there was still a part of me that felt apprehensive about what might happen if Olivia found out. It wasn't something I liked to think about, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I knew Olivia hadn't been in contact with her family much since the divorce, but the day would come when she'd find out about us. One evening, Rachel and I were curled up on my couch, watching a movie. She had her head resting on my chest, her arm draped across my stomach. It was one of those quiet, peaceful moments I'd come to treasure. Just the two of us, no distractions, no complications. As the credits rolled, Rachel shifted to look up at me, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking." I muted the TV and turned to her, curious. "About what?" "About us," she said, sitting up a little. "About how we're going to handle things moving forward. I know we've talked about keeping things low-key for now, but I feel like we can't avoid telling Olivia forever." My stomach tightened at the mention of Olivia's name. I knew this conversation was coming eventually, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I've thought about that too, I admitted, sitting up straighter. It's not something I'm looking forward to, but you're right. We can't keep this from her forever. Rachel nodded, her fingers playing absently with the edge of the blanket we had draped over our legs. I just don't want her to hear it from someone else. I want her to hear it from us. I know it's going to be hard, but it's the right thing to do. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. You're right. I've been avoiding it, but we can't keep pretending she doesn't exist. Eventually, she'll find out, and I'd rather it come from us than through some third party. Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice soft. I know it's going to be awkward, but I think if we're honest with her, she'll have to accept it eventually. She might not like it at first, but we're not doing anything wrong. We've both moved on. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer. I just don't want it to cause more drama than it has to. I'm over all the baggage from the divorce, and I don't want to get dragged back into it. We won't, Rachel said firmly. This is about us, not her. We're doing this for us, not because of anything she might think. She doesn't get to control our lives anymore. I smiled, grateful for her strength. You're right. We'll figure this out together. Rachel kissed my shoulder, then leaned back to look at me. So, should we tell her soon? I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, we should. It's better to get it over with than to let it hang over our heads. We decided to tell Olivia the following weekend. It wasn't easy to figure out how to contact her, considering I hadn't spoken to her since she moved out, but Rachel managed to reach out through a mutual family member who agreed to pass on the message. The idea was simple. Meet somewhere neutral, have a conversation, and explain the situation in as gentle a way as possible. The day of the meeting, I was a bundle of nerves. Even though I knew Rachel and I had every right to be together, there was still a part of me that dreaded Olivia's reaction. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation, but I also knew this wasn't going to be a simple, easy conversation. We arranged to meet Olivia at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far enough away from our usual hangouts to avoid running into anyone we knew. When Rachel and I arrived, Olivia was already sitting at a table near the window, her expression unreadable. She looked different, thinner, maybe a little more worn down than I remembered. The months since our divorce had clearly taken a toll on her, just as they had on me. Rachel squeezed my hand as we walked toward the table, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This was it. Hi, Olivia, Rachel said as we reached the table, her voice gentle but firm. Olivia looked up at us, her eyes narrowing slightly. Rachel, Ethan. Her tone was cool, but not outright hostile. Thanks for meeting us, I said, sitting down across from her. Rachel sat beside me, her hands still resting on mine under the table. Olivia crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. What's this about? You two seemed pretty eager to get me here. I exchanged a glance with Rachel, then turned back to Olivia. We wanted to talk to you about something important. It's not an easy conversation, but we thought it was better for you to hear it from us. Olivia's eyes flicked between the two of us, suspicion creeping into her expression. What is it? Just spit it out. Rachel took a deep breath, then spoke. Olivia, Ethan and I, we've been seeing each other. For a moment, Olivia just stared at us, her expression frozen in disbelief. Then, slowly, her face twisted into a scowl. You've been what? She demanded, her voice rising slightly. Are you serious? I held up a hand, trying to keep the situation from escalating. Olivia, please. Let us explain. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Explain what? That you're dating my sister? That you moved on from our marriage that quickly? How long has this been going on? It didn't start until after the divorce, I said quickly. We didn't plan for this to happen. It developed over time. Rachel chimed in, her voice calm but firm. We didn't want to hurt you, Olivia. That's why we're telling you now, instead of letting you find out some other way. We wanted to be honest with you. Olivia's jaw clenched, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to explode. But then, she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Well, isn't this just perfect? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You two get to play happy couple while I'm left in the dust. How convenient for you. I felt a pang of guilt, But I knew I couldn't let Olivia guilt-trip us into feeling bad for moving on with our lives. Olivia, I'm sorry things didn't work out between us, but we've both moved on. Rachel and I, this is real. We care about each other. Real? Olivia scoffed, her eyes narrowing. You're dating my sister, Ethan. How real can that possibly be? Rachel squeezed my hand under the table, then spoke up. Olivia, I know this is hard for you to hear, but we didn't plan this. It just happened, and we're trying to be respectful about it. Respectful? Olivia's laugh was sharp and cold. You call this respectful? You should have told me sooner. We're telling you now, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. We didn't want to blindside you, but we also needed to make sure this was something real before we told you. Olivia stared at us for a long moment, her eyes full of anger and hurt. Finally, she shook her head, standing up abruptly. I can't do this, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I can't sit here and listen to this. Before either of us could respond, Olivia turned and stormed out of the cafe, leaving us sitting there in stunned silence. For a few moments, neither Rachel nor I said anything. The tension in the air was thick, and the conversation had gone about as badly as I had expected. I knew Olivia wouldn't take the news well, but seeing the hurt and anger in her eyes still stung. It wasn't easy to watch someone you once loved walk away, even if that love had long since faded. Rachel let out a shaky breath beside me, her hand still gripping mine under the table. That didn't go well. I shook my head. No, it didn't. I'm sorry, Ethan, she said softly. I knew this was going to be hard, but I didn't think she'd react like that. I sighed, rubbing my face with my free hand. It was never going to be easy. She's angry, and she has every right to be. But we did what we had to do. Rachel nodded, leaning her head against my shoulder. You're right. We did the right thing. We sat there for a while longer, neither of us saying much. The weight of the conversation with Olivia hung over us like a dark cloud, but I knew that eventually things would settle. Olivia would have to come to terms with the fact that Rachel and I were together, whether she liked it or not. We had done our part by being honest with her, and now it was up to her to process it in her own time. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, even though the conversation with Olivia had been difficult. We had taken the first step toward moving forward without the shadow of secrecy hanging over us. Rachel and I could finally be open about our relationship, and that was a weight off my shoulders. But it wasn't long before I started hearing from mutual friends about Olivia's reaction. Word had spread quickly, too quickly for my liking, and it seemed that Olivia had been venting her frustrations to anyone who would listen. Some friends were supportive, understanding that Rachel and I had every right to be together. Others, not so much. One afternoon, I received a call from Sarah, one of our mutual friends who had been at the bar with us a few weeks earlier. She sounded concerned, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice as she spoke. Hey, Ethan, she began. I wanted to give you a heads up. Olivia's been talking to people about you and Rachel. I sighed, already knowing where this was going. Yeah, I figured. What's she saying? Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. She's telling people that you and Rachel started seeing each other before the divorce. That you were cheating on her with Rachel. My jaw tightened in frustration. That's not true. You know that, right? Of course I do, Sarah said quickly. But some people are buying into it. They're saying that it's pretty convenient for you to end up with her sister so soon after the divorce. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Great. Just what we needed. I just wanted to warn you, Sarah said gently. I know this is tough, but I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else. Thanks, Sarah, I said, appreciating the heads up. I'll deal with it. After I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time, letting the frustration wash over me. I knew Olivia was angry, but I didn't expect her to spread lies about me. The last thing I needed was for people to think I had been unfaithful during our marriage. It wasn't true, and it hurt to think that people might believe it. Later that evening, I told Rachel what Sarah had said. She wasn't surprised, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Do you think people will believe her? Rachel asked, her voice tinged with concern. Some might, I admitted. But the people who know us, the people who matter, they'll know the truth. Rachel sighed, resting her head on my shoulder. I hate that she's doing this. It's like she can't just let us be happy. I know, I said, wrapping my arm around her. But we can't control what she does. All we can do is keep moving forward. Rachel nodded, and we sat there in silence for a while, both of us processing the situation. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't easy, but I knew that we would get through it. We had each other, and that was enough. As time passed, the rumors about Rachel and me eventually died down. People moved on, and those who mattered stuck by us, knowing that we hadn't done anything wrong. Olivia, it seemed, had come to accept the situation, though we hadn't heard much from her since that day at the cafe. Rachel and I grew closer as the months went by. Our relationship blossomed into something that felt real and lasting, something that I hadn't expected to find after the mess of my divorce. It wasn't perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. We spent more time together, exploring new places, trying new things, and building a life that was separate from the past. Rachel had even introduced me to her circle of friends, and I found myself slowly becoming part of her world in a way that felt natural and right. One evening, about a year after we had started dating, Rachel and I were sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers. It was one of those perfect, quiet moments where everything felt right. Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder, her fingers intertwined with mine. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "About what?" I asked, glancing down at her. "About us," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "About where we're headed." I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Where do you think we're headed?" She looked up at me, her eyes full of warmth. "I think we're headed somewhere good." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of contentment wash over me. "Yeah, I think so too." As we sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far I had come since the end of my marriage. I had found love again, and this time, it was with someone who truly understood me, someone who made me feel whole. The future felt bright, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where life would take us. As the months passed, Rachel and I continued to build our life together. Our relationship had grown in ways I never anticipated, and the love we shared felt stronger with each passing day. The complications that once seemed insurmountable, the lingering presence of Olivia, the whispers from people who doubted us, had faded into the background. Rachel and I had come out on the other side, and we were better for it. We were still cautious in the way we navigated our relationship around Olivia. Although Rachel remained close with her parents, their contact with Olivia had become sparse. Rachel's parents knew about us, and though it was initially awkward, they had been supportive. They could see how happy we were, and ultimately, that's what mattered to them. Olivia, however, remained distant. She hadn't spoken to Rachel since the day at the cafe. Occasionally, Rachel would get updates about her through mutual acquaintances, but there was never any direct communication. I knew it hurt Rachel to have her relationship with her sister fractured, but we had both come to terms with the fact that Olivia needed time. One evening, about a year and a half after Rachel and I had first started dating, I found myself thinking about how far we had come. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment, watching some mindless TV show, and I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led us to this moment. The darkness of my divorce, the complications with Olivia, the uncertainty about whether Rachel and I could ever make it work. It all seemed like a distant memory now. As I watched Rachel laugh at something on the screen, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. I had found something real with her, something worth fighting for. And as much as the past had tried to hold me back, it was the future that I was focused on now. That night, as we got ready for bed, I made a decision. I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Rachel. I knew that without a doubt. The idea of proposing had been floating around in the back of my mind for a while, but now I was certain. I didn't want to wait any longer. I had been through enough to know that life was too short to put off what truly mattered. The next morning, I made a plan. I called Rachel's parents to ask for their blessing, and they couldn't have been more supportive. I wanted everything to be perfect, but I also knew that Rachel wasn't one for grand gestures or flashy displays of affection. She was practical, grounded, and appreciated the simple things in life. So, I decided to keep it simple. I spent the next week planning a special evening for us, something intimate and meaningful. I wanted the proposal to reflect who we were as a couple, quiet, thoughtful, and genuine. I booked a reservation at our favorite restaurant, a cozy little Italian place we had gone to on one of our early dates, and I made sure everything was just right. When the evening finally arrived, I could barely contain my nerves. Rachel knew something was up, but she didn't press me for details. She seemed content to go along with whatever I had planned, and that made me love her even more. As we sat down for dinner, I could feel the anticipation building, but I tried to stay calm. I wanted this moment to be perfect. After dinner, we took a walk through the park near the restaurant, just like we had done so many times before. The sun had already set, and the soft glow of the street lamps cast a warm light over the path. We strolled hand in hand, enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Eventually, we reached a small clearing in the park, a place where we had often stopped to sit and talk on our walks. I guided Rachel to the bench, and we sat down together, the cool night air brushing against our skin. "Rachel," I began, turning to face her. She looked at me, her eyes curious but warm. "Yeah?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately, about everything we've been through. It hasn't always been easy, but I can't imagine my life without you. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible." Her expression softened, and she reached out to take my hand. "Ethan, I love you, Rachel," I continued, my voice steady. "I love everything about you. Your kindness, your strength, the way you always know how to make me smile, even on the hardest days. You've been my rock through all of this, and I can't imagine spending my life with anyone else." Tears filled her eyes, and she smiled, squeezing my hand. "I love you too, Ethan. So much." I stood up from the bench, reaching into my pocket for the small velvet box I had been carrying all night. As I dropped to one knee in front of her, Rachel's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. "Rachel," I said, opening the box to reveal the ring I had chosen for her, simple yet elegant, just like her. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Rachel was too stunned to speak. Then, tears streaming down her cheeks, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, of course I will." I slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled me up from the ground, wrapping her arms around me in a tight embrace. We stood there, holding each other in the middle of the park, the world around us fading away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. It was just the two of us, together, ready to face whatever the future had in store. The months that followed were a whirlwind of planning and excitement. Rachel and I decided on a small, intimate wedding. Just close family and friends, nothing extravagant. We both wanted something simple, something that reflected who we were as a couple. As we worked through the details, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief at how far we had come. There had been a time, not so long ago, when I couldn't have imagined being happy again, let alone planning a future with someone I loved. But here I was, doing exactly that. As the wedding day approached, Rachel and I talked about whether or not to invite Olivia. It was a difficult decision, one that weighed heavily on both of us. Despite everything that had happened, Rachel still loved her sister, and part of her hoped that Olivia would eventually come around. But we also knew that inviting her could potentially stir up old wounds and create unnecessary tension on what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. In the end, we decided to send Olivia an invitation. We weren't sure if she would come, but we wanted to give her the chance to be a part of this new chapter in our lives. It was a gesture of goodwill, a way of saying that we had moved on and that she was welcome to do the same. The day of the wedding arrived, and everything was perfect. The weather was beautiful, sunny and warm, with just a light breeze. We had chosen to hold the ceremony at a small garden just outside the city, surrounded by blooming flowers and tall, graceful trees. It was the kind of place that felt intimate and peaceful, exactly what we had wanted. As I stood at the altar, waiting for Rachel to walk down the aisle, I felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. My heart was pounding in my chest, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of anticipation. I knew, without a doubt, that I was making the right decision. Rachel was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I couldn't wait to begin this new chapter together. The music started, and I looked up to see Rachel stepping into view, her arm linked with her father's. She looked radiant in her simple, elegant wedding dress, her smile lighting up her entire face. As she made her way down the aisle, our eyes locked, and in that moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of us, and the love we shared. When Rachel reached the altar, her father gave her hand to me, and I felt a surge of emotion wash over me. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The ceremony was short but meaningful. We exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other for the rest of our lives. As I slipped the wedding band onto Rachel's finger, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led us to this point. All the challenges, the heartache, the uncertainty. But in the end, it had all been worth it. We had found each other, and we had built something beautiful. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, I pulled Rachel into my arms and kissed her, the cheers of our friends and family ringing in my ears. It was a perfect moment, one that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. The reception that followed was a blur of laughter, dancing, and celebration. We kept it small, just the people who had been there for us through it all, our closest friends and family. As we danced together under the twinkling lights, I couldn't stop smiling. I was married to the woman I loved, and the future felt full of possibility. At one point during the evening, Rachel and I stepped away from the crowd to catch our breath. We stood at the edge of the garden, watching as our guests continued to celebrate. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "I can't believe we did it," Rachel said with a laugh, looking up at me. "We're actually married." I smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah, we did. And it feels pretty damn good." Rachel's eyes sparkled with happiness as she leaned into me. "I love you, Ethan." "I love you too, Rachel," I replied, my heart swelling with emotion. "I'm so lucky to have you." As we stood there, enjoying the quiet moment together, I noticed someone standing near the entrance to the garden. It was Olivia. She hadn't said anything to us during the ceremony, and I wasn't sure if she would show up at all. But there she was, standing at a distance, watching us. Her expression was hard to read. There was a mix of emotions in her eyes, but she didn't seem angry. Instead, she looked resigned, maybe even a little sad. Rachel followed my gaze and saw her too. She tensed slightly, but I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. After a moment, Olivia nodded slightly in our direction, then turned and walked away. It wasn't much, but it was something. A silent acknowledgement, perhaps, that she had come to terms with what had happened, that she was ready to move on, just as we had. Rachel sighed softly, leaning her head against my shoulder. "I guess that's her way of saying goodbye." "Maybe," I said, wrapping my arm around her. "Or maybe it's her way of saying she's ready to move forward." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Either way, I hope she finds her own happiness." "I really do." "I do too," I agreed, holding her close. As the night wore on, Rachel and I spent the rest of the evening celebrating with the people we loved. The past no longer had a hold on us. We were free to live our lives, to build our future together, and to embrace the happiness we had found in each other. And as I looked at Rachel, laughing and smiling with our friends, I knew that the best was yet to come. The years that followed were filled with joy, love, and growth. Rachel and I moved into a new house together, a place where we could start fresh and build new memories. We traveled, explored new places, and took on new challenges, always supporting each other through whatever came our way.